So I want to spend some time looking at how New England is this unique place, but it's also similar. It's also similar to what we've seen in terms of Virginia. There are going to be some key factors that I think we have to wrap our mind around if we're going to understand New England culture, for better or for worse. Right? For better or for worse, our understanding is going to depend on wrapping our minds around these key factors. Of course, one of the key factors in New England is going to be the factor of religion. Right? It's going to be the factor of religion. Now, it's kind of interesting because as we saw in those laws in Virginia, religion does play a role there too. Remember, they were talking about dishonor and shame of Christianity and all that kind of stuff, or Christian literally written into the laws of Virginia. So if religion was that important in a quote-unquote secular society, think about how important it's going to be in a society that sets itself up based on the Bible, right? So these New England colonies, what goes into making them what they are? As we've seen, culture often depends on where you are, right? Remember that first or second day when we talked about a kind of working definition of culture, how people relate to their environment. If your environment changes, then your culture may have to make certain changes to adapt to that. So think about how different the New England environment is going to be than Virginia. I don't know if any of you have spent time living or traveling in the East Coast, but I have relatives from Massachusetts, and I myself am a California boy. So when I got off the plane in December in Massachusetts wearing shorts and some Timberlands, people were looking at me like, what is wrong with this guy? There's 2 feet of snow on the ground. Why do you have a T-shirt on and some shorts? They looked at me even more strangely when I'm outside shoveling snow with shorts and Timberlands and a sweatshirt on. My legs don't get cold. It's my upper body that gets cold. But plus, shoveling snow was fun for me because I'd never done it before. I asked my sister, hey, can I shovel? You mind if I shovel the driveway? She's like, go ahead. Right? I've done this my whole life. And I'm like, how much snow is out there? She's like, 28 inches. I'm like, that's not even inches. That's feet. That's 2 feet. That's 28 inches. That makes it sound smaller. Now, people drove by and they're like, you're from California, aren't you? I'm like, how'd you know? They're like, we just know. Right? Because that's a different environment. It snows there. It's cold. It's a different environment. It's much greener. My relatives often talk about how brown California looks compared to the East because of the greenery of the trees. We live in a desert. Right? It's a different environment. The northern coast is different than the Chesapeake and the northeast coast. Climate's different, geography's different. What that means, first and foremost, based on our discussion previously, was that there is no one kind of merchantable commodity like there was in Virginia. What was the merchantable commodity in Virginia? Tobacco. Right? When they find that, it's like, okay, this is it. Everything is going to rotate around the fact that tobacco is so important. It can be sold. They have their green gold in that sense. That cannot be produced in New England. So that seems like a curse at first, but it's going to end up being kind of indirectly a blessing for the New England economy. They don't have one thing like that, so they're going to have to diversify, right? They're going to have to do what those tobacco planters did not do. They're going to have to diversify their economy. And this ultimately will make for a stronger economy, you can argue. It's also going to make for a different culture. So what do they have in New England? Well, they're going to have a variety of options, right? They're going to have a variety of options. New England is going to be very popular for not just for those that are interested in investment like the Chesapeake, but it's going to be popular for those religious dissenters, right? Those folks that are looking to set up their own society based on their own religious views. Now remember, these pilgrims are not in favor of religious freedom for all. That is not what they were about. They were in favor of religious freedom for them, right? The freedom to practice their vision of religion. And in fact, they're not very tolerant of other practices. So you might think twice about going to New England if you weren't a Puritan. If you weren't a member of the Congregationalist Church, which is what officially they were. Now again, at this time in Europe, most English practiced a version of religion that was still similar to Catholicism. Remember John Calvin and the Protestant Reformation and all of that stuff we talked about. They're called Puritans, right? These folks didn't really call themselves that. Other people called them Puritans because they were always trying to purify the church, right? They thought the Anglican Church did not go far enough in purifying itself, right? So that's what others called it, but the name kind of sticks, right? Because they want to push the revolution further in a way. Well, these Puritans start to grow in influence, right? They start to gain power in England and ultimately in the society that we're going to see here. But in England, they start to gain some momentum. They start to get a louder voice by the end of Queen Elizabeth's reign and into King James's reign. You're hearing more and more from these Puritans. This is going to be an issue later on in England. In fact, it's going to lead to civil war in England, as we'll see in a second. But there's something about this culture that seemed to stick, even though they're not very, very tolerant of other religious views. There are going to be certain things they do that would draw people this direction. One of them is this notion of the Puritan work ethic, right? Puritan work ethic. We still use that phrase, Puritan work ethic, to this day when we're talking about sort of American ideals like the American dream. Hard work pays, right? This notion of, put your head down, keep your nose to the grindstone, don't complain, work hard, it'll ultimately pay off, right? This idea that we live in a meritocracy, you ultimately will get what you deserve, right? This notion of this Puritan work ethic, I think, is central to that, or understanding it is central to that. And at this time, it's actually going to endear these Puritans to others. The idea that hard work pays, the idea that God likes hard work, is actually going to be important. Think if you're a merchant or a business person or an investor even, right? You probably had been told that the pursuit of money was evil, right? Pursuing money, that's the devil stuff. Well, the Puritans are like, well, not necessarily, right? God likes hard work. He doesn't like laziness, they would say. So some merchants are like, that sounds okay. So in addition to these religious folks, you are going to have merchants and entrepreneurs and commercial farmers that may find themselves coming towards New England, right? And actually helping to increase the population there. New England is going to go through a rapid population growth. I'll give you some numbers on that in a second. But these Puritans, as we know, are also very vocal critics of those in power in England, right? They're talking directly about the king and challenging the Anglican Church. This is going to be an issue in the Old World. It's going to lead to civil war in the Old World, and it's going to impact the New World as well. But by the early 1600s, Puritans are actually prominent in a number of churches and as professors at universities. This gives them some influence. They're, in fact, helping to train the next generation, plant these ideas. And that does not make everyone happy. Right? King James, who we've seen before, remember King James the first comes into power after Elizabeth. King James will not continue Elizabeth's sort of religious tolerance. Remember that whole Elizabethan settlement and all that? James is like, no, I'm not really here for that. Right? He will abandon this religious tolerance. He will start to persecute Puritans. I think he sees them as a challenge. Right? He sees them as challenging his authority, I should say. This is going to provide the context for the migration for many of these Puritans. Remember back to Bloody Mary, when they had been persecuted for their religious identity, religious beliefs. They had never forgotten that. So now King James seems to be doing some of the same things. A lot of folks are like, let's go. We got to go someplace else. England is no longer home. Let's go form a new imagined community. But they do not try New England first. This is not the first stop, not the first attempt. They would first go to Holland. Right? They would go to Holland in 1609 and set up a society among the Dutch. But they don't ultimately like that. They felt like Dutch society was too permissive, that it was corrupting their children, right? And so they eventually leave there as well and decide, let's set up our own society, right? Our own imagined community, to use our phrase. And therefore, they're going to end up in New England. Now, how does this happen? Now, we know England had been interested in the New World for a while, as we laid out before. We know that there's already a settlement at Jamestown 13 years before the Mayflower will arrive here. The English are often in conflict with other European powers in the Old World, right? They're in conflict with the French. They're in conflict conflict with the Dutch. They're in conflict with the Spanish. Well, that means that they're also in conflict here in the New World. So there is a French post not too far away that the English look at as a problem. There are some Dutch outposts that the English will look at as a problem. So when we think about New England as a landing spot, it's kind of, in a way, it was unlikely that they end up in New England. There are at least two reasons why New England would not have been the first spot chosen. It would not have been the first spot chosen. And in fact, the London Company is going to send them to Virginia at first. They end up getting blown 500 miles to the north. But New England would not have been the first choice. Number one, because there was already European powers there, European contact there. Right? The French had some trading connections. The Dutch had some outposts along the Hudson. And so the British moving in there would not have been readily accepted. Right? When they're at war in the old world, they're also at war in the new world. Nationalism, imagined community. In fact, they would send an expedition to destroy a French outpost at Port Royal, and they would start to harass the Dutch along the Hudson River. This is going to continue. They want to push them out. Right? They want to move these European powers out of the way. But even if those European powers had not been there, Native people are already there. There's a massive number of Native peoples in New England. A massive number of Native peoples in New England. Well, how then do they end up here? Well, a couple of things are going to happen. One in particular, and I want you to think about how these new settlers might interpret this. If you're a religious person, how might you interpret this event that happens? So you thinking about New England as a possibility, but there's no vacancy there. Right? There are 120,000 Native peoples there in 1616. 120,000. But suddenly, in the 2-year period between 1616 and 1618, an epidemic wipes out half the native population. Like half the native population will die of disease in like 2 years. Now, if you're a religious person, how might you interpret that? If you're a Puritan, how do you think they interpreted that? It's a sign. Obviously, we must be destined to move in here, right? God is on our side. Right? Now, of course, from a native perspective, this is going to be horrible. They might interpret it as they're being punished for something, in fact, right? It may have been some of those early traders, even a handful of French traders coming in. If they bring some old world diseases that could ravage native peoples and kind of clear the way. But England then is like, wow, look, it's opened up for us. It's almost like Moses in the Red Sea, right? It's parted. We must be destined to move here. Now, this actually raises a larger point. I want to come back to this concept a little bit later, but I want to introduce it now. This term, if you could read my handwriting, is American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism. Often this term, American exceptionalism, is used in American history to describe really two separate phenomena. We'll talk about the first one right now. And the first one is pretty straightforward in terms of the idea that Americans are exceptional. This idea that there's something exceptional about this nation, something chosen, something unique. We almost feel like God has always been on our side. Right? Looking at American history, there are a series of events that seem like miracles. So if you are a religious person, you're like, look, this is evidence. We could go back to Jamestown. Remember, they're all starving, eating rats, but somehow they survived. Right? Natives helped them. When things improve, they find tobacco. That's like winning the lottery, right? These pilgrims, same thing. They're starving. They're going to get saved. Things turn around. Right? We feel like we keep getting evidence of this. Or 1616. There are all these people in the way. Not anymore. So keep in mind this notion of exceptionalism. Some say that this notion of exceptionalism will remain with us. These pilgrims come and they want to set up what one of their ministers called a city on the hill. It's taken from the biblical verse that you should establish a city on the hill that can be like a beacon of light for the rest of the world. So literally imagine like a hill and you build a town up there. Right? It's almost like, was it Westeros? And when you come into the town, you can kind of see it from a distance and everybody's like, oh. Right? It's a model. It's a blueprint. These pilgrims wanted to set up a city on the hill that would be a model for other societies, that would be a model for other colonies on how to set up a society. they believe there was something exceptional and chosen about them from the beginning. So I think when we see episodes like this, it's not perhaps a surprise how they would interpret it. We'll come back to the second part of American exceptionalism later, but this first idea that there's something unique, there's something exceptional, is a major part of this conversation about American exceptionalism. Maybe we have a gift to give to the rest of the world, a gift of democracy or the gift of capitalism. Now, some say that that remains with us, even in our foreign policy today, that we feel that we should spread democracy, right? Now, some say that's a great thing because it's a gift and we should share it. Others say, maybe we shouldn't be involved in trying to remake governments or remake economies elsewhere. Maybe that's problematic. We'll talk more about that because there's going to be some shifts in our foreign policy over time. But I think a lot of it does go back to this notion of American exceptionalism. There's something exceptional about us. It's almost like it would be selfish of us to keep it. If you got a gift, you want to share it. If you have a mission, put in religious terms, you should share it. So that event, I think, is an important one in terms of how they're going to interpret it, right? How they're going to interpret it specifically. So between 1616 and 1618, the population goes from about 120,000 to 60 or 70,000. Many are ill, many are moving further west away from Europeans, and it seems to open up some space, you could say. Remember, those Puritans had tried Holland first. They're not happy there. They feel like it's corrupting their children, and so eventually they will end up here. Now, there's a couple of unique things about New England. Most of these immigrants, as opposed to what we saw in Virginia, most of these immigrants come in family groups. Right? They immigrate in family groups. So last time I gave you the example of a Vegas trip. Right? If you're going to Vegas with your parents, that's one trip. Right? If you're going to Vegas with your homegirls, that might be a very different trip. You might be staying in the same hotel for the same number of days, but it might be different, right? Based on who you're with. So just like we talked about the Chesapeake and all these kind of single, young, unattached men running around, it's going to be a different experience in some ways with New England. Right? You have parental authority, you have traditional sort of leadership figures all coming over. You're intending to set up a more permanent society from the beginning. So New England is going to look different from Virginia. You don't have tobacco. It's going to look different. So they mostly come in family groups. There are some single men, but mostly family groups, and I think this makes a huge difference. Now, even with all of that, they are going to have some similarities with Virginia. Nearly half of them die that first winter. Right? They're starving. They're freezing. They're saved by native peoples once again. I think about the whole Thanksgiving story. They're saved by native peoples. So there are some similarities. They're actually rescued by the Wampanoag peoples. The Wampanoag are some Native Americans in the area in modern-day kind of Massachusetts, I believe. Now, why did the Wampanoags help them? Well, they might have been good people. Right? Hey, look, these newcomers are struggling. They have no idea what they're doing here. Let's help them out. But they also may be strategic. Right? The Wampanoag have some traditional Native American enemies, especially the Narragansetts, who are a native group in Rhode Island. They don't get along. So these newcomers might be valuable allies. Hey, look, let's help them survive. They got guns. Maybe they can be helpful in our dealings with our own enemies. So think, imagine community. These native peoples aren't thinking of themselves as quote-unquote Indians, all the same, homogenous. They're divided themselves. And that is how we have to understand these complicated interactions right around imagined community. In the same way that Europeans are divided, these natives are divided. Very similar situation in some ways. So again, these Puritans are seeking to set up this society. Many of them, though, are still active in England, in the Old World. Right? In fact, they have tremendous influence. They will be granted a royal charter in 1629, as you heard in the video. So you have the Plymouth colony, specifically that town. But the larger Massachusetts Bay Colony is going to be developing. Right? So in 1629, they're granted a royal charter for the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They got an entire colony. And it's going to start to grow and develop. Right? It's going to start to grow and develop quite rapidly, in fact. In the 14 years from the granting of the charter, so 1629 to 1643, about 20,000 will emigrate to the colony. 20,000. Massive numbers. So imagine the neighbors are like, what in the world is going on here? We got 0 folks and we got 20,000, right? In a relatively short amount of time, things change quickly. This is a huge tipping point. The town of Boston will be founded in 1630. The colony of Connecticut is here by 1640 or so. It's growing rapidly, right? Things are changing quickly. Things are tipping, it seems, quite quickly. Now, the native peoples find these British settlers to be kind of a different society than the British or the Dutch. Remember, we talked about that distinction between communities of exclusion and inclusion. Right? The natives are like, these folks are different. They're not like the handful of French traders or the Dutch societies we've seen. They're different. They kind of recognize that fairly quickly. And in many ways, Massachusetts Indians are ill-prepared for the settlement that comes, especially disease. It's going to really run rampant. If a handful of traders can bring disease that wipes out half the population in 2 years, imagine the impact of 20,000, 30,000 settlers all of a sudden being here. People are going to be decimated. Well, that's the wrong term, because decimated makes it sound like you lose a tenth of your population. Some estimates are 80 to 90% of some societies are gone in a couple of years, especially those right along the coast that first interact. And those that survive might be weakened, right? They might be barely surviving. So this is gonna, it's gonna be a huge impact on these folks. They will see even more disease. There's a smallpox epidemic in the 1630s, early 1630s, and so native peoples are continually, literally fighting for their lives in many respects. At the same time, we keep making the point that the old world impacts the new world. Right? The old world impacts the new world, and so things happening in England will continue to impact this colony here in New England. Right? England impacts New England. Specifically, Civil War. Civil War. King Charles I, who's King of England at this point, and the Puritans in Parliament will find themselves battling, literally, in a civil war. By 1642, they're in civil war. And surprisingly, King Charles is on the losing end. The Puritans win. In 1649, they will defeat King Charles, and they will execute King Charles in 1649. They will found a Puritan Commonwealth. Right? They get rid of the king, literally kill the king and take the king's place. Their leader, a gentleman by the name of Oliver Cromwell, will be, I think his title was like the Lord Protector of the Realm or something like that. Sounds like a Game of Thrones title. So in some ways, the Puritans win. Some of them here are like, hey, we can go home. We won. There are a few that leave and go back, but most are going to stay in New England, of course. But think about this connection between old and new world, right? When things are happening in England, it kind of ripples across the Atlantic and continues to impact England's colonies. Yet, this society is developing in and of itself. It's unique in many ways. That unique environment we talked about is going to play into its favor. Lacking one main crop, New Englanders will be forced to diversify their economy. They're going to have small farms. They may not have huge plantations of tobacco, but they may have smaller farms and grow other crops. Remember in that first video how many trees there are in New England, right? So lumber is going to be a major industry. They start cutting down these trees, supplying the colonies and the mother country. Shipbuilding. New England shipbuilding will be a huge industry. Fishing, lumber, all these sorts of things. So they have a lot of irons in the fire, which you econ majors know can make for a stronger economy. You got some diversification. Remember those tobacco farmers, they only want to plant tobacco. That's what's making the money. But what happens if you have a bad year in the tobacco industry? You don't get some rain, you're in trouble. Right? So this actually might be a blessing in disguise. By the end of the century, they're going to be the kind of middlemen in trade between the various British colonies. Even if you're a tobacco farmer, how are you going to ship your crop back to the mother country? You've got to go through New England. Right? You need lumber from New England, and you need ships built in New England. So in many ways, they're going to be well-positioned moving forward. Right? Well-positioned moving forward. Culturally, this is important. Economically, this is important. Politically, this is important. But just as important are a couple of other factors. education is an important factor in New England. Education is a really, really important factor in New England. Literacy, in particular, is a good indicator of levels of education in New England. Now, literacy is going to be really high in this region. Why? Why do you think it might be really important to be able to read in New England? Any guesses? If you're a religious society, you want to set up a society based on the Bible, you got to be able to read the Bible. So this is going to have some direct and indirect implications in New England. Literacy in New England is going to be much higher than in the South. It's also going to be higher than in England. Now, this is kind of unheard of, to have education and literacy rates in a far-off colony be higher than in the mother country. But this is exactly what happens, in part because it's so specifically Bible-based. I'll give you an example of what I mean. As early as 1647, so only 27 years after the Mayflower, only 17 years after the founding of Boston. In 1647, the colony passes a law that requires any town with 50 or more families. So when a town got 50 or more families in it, you had to build a public school. You had to collect money and build a public school. So as soon as you got 50 families, you had to have a public school. I'll give you an even better example. Harvard University is really old. Harvard University is founded in 1636. 1636, only 16 years after they first arrived. Only 6 years after Boston is built, they throw Harvard up. And initially it's going to train ministers. So this level of education is really important. And it's going to actually, in many ways, define the region. Right? It's going to distinguish the region from the other colonies in many ways, and even from the mother country, this literacy. Literacy is higher in New England and the South, or even in Europe. But education is gendered. What does that mean? What do you think that means? Education is gendered. What do you think I mean by that, especially based on some of our conversations in the videos yesterday? What does that mean? Education is going to be skewed towards the men. There's an idea that men should be educated, but women, for what? Why? There are actually gendered ideas that women might not be as intelligent. Some thought women's brains were smaller. Some thought if you educated women, it actually harmed them. They'd have certain breakdowns. They go crazy. That's why colleges weren't built for women. I think I often tell this story. I can't remember if I told it in this class, but there was a young student about to attend UCLA, a young, handsome gentleman. Okay, it was me. So in 1991, I go to UCLA, and I'm like taking my first history class in the math and science building. Right? And first of all, I was like, why is my history class in the math and science building? It don't make no sense. It's like 20 minutes across campus. I'm like, what's going on? So I go to the math and science building, and I find my class. It was a weird building. You got to go like inside and outside. You come out on a different floor. It was confusing, like several of the buildings here. And I was so happy because a friend of mine from high school, my friend Jessie, she was also attending UCLA, and she was in the same building. I was like, hey, Jessie, what's going on? And so I went to my class, and during the break, we had a bathroom break. And so I saw Jessie. I went to the men's room, and she went to the other restroom, and then she came out of the restroom, and she's making this face. She's like, I'm like, what are you doing? What's going on? She's like, she looked like distressed. I'm like, what's up? She's like, the restrooms. You know, my thoughts, somebody in there, like somebody tried to grab you or something? Like, do we need to handle something? You know? She's like, the restrooms. I'm like, yeah, like, tell me what's going on, right? She's like, the restrooms. I'm like, please tell me what's going on. She's like, the ladies' rooms have urinals in them. And I was like, huh? Like, are college ladies different in some ways? Like, what's... Now, you could probably tell me, why do you think the ladies' rooms in the math and science building at UCLA in the 1990s all had urinals in them? Any guesses? Say that again? Yeah. When they built the math and science building, and when they built UCLA, colleges were for men. And especially the math and sciences were expected to be a kind of male domain. Why would you build ladies' restrooms in a building where you did not expect women to be? It's really not until the 1960s and afterwards with affirmative action that colleges are forced open for women. Now we know that the college population is majority women. That was not the case until after the 1960s. So these structures that were built, especially around education, ideas were there, no, why would women be there? This has a long history to it, in this country and elsewhere, yes.
I think this town was like focused on religion, and they were like men should leave the house, and like it was like written in the Bible like women should follow, so it's like already in the concept.
Yeah, true. A lot of them, again, how might one interpret the Bible, right? A lot of texts have to be interpreted, and people often see what they want to see too, right? You think about the Bible and how it's going to be used historically. There are verses in there that say, slaves, obey your masters. So slave owners are like, well, hey, look, slaves, obey your masters. Some of the slaves, when they found ways to learn to read, are like, wait a second, Moses is leading the slaves out of Egypt. This part says an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. So you just with me. That means, so again, you got to be careful. Folks are selective. But you're right. Right? A lot of the tradition is based on the interpretation of the text in that way. You're exactly right. So again, these ideas have a history to them, is really my point with this. And we saw some of it in the fairer sex stuff yesterday, right? Assumptions. But I wanted you to think about the fact that these have a long history to them. So Harvard is 1636. Yale is built in 1647. Right? Literacy is going to be higher in New England than the rest of the colonies and even in the mother country. Puritans, as you said, stressed well-ordered communities. They thought the family was a microcosm of the society itself, so the men should be in charge, just as the minister should be in charge of the community, right? But you had to fall in line, and this kind of hierarchical ordering was important. Order and authority were important. Think about how this plays out in terms of the Salem witch trials episode we looked at. How it plays out in terms of class, right? Men were supposed to listen to their husbands. Even lower class husbands were supposed to listen to wealthy husbands, or wealthy men, right? And all of them were supposed to listen to the religious and civil authorities, which often were the same person, right? Cotton Mather was a minister and he was in charge of the court. Right? Same kind of thing. Now, there are some complications for Puritans, and then we'll wrap this up because y'all have been sitting for a while. This issue of status is important. When the Puritans come and set up a town, they built the church first in the center, and then they built around it. Right? And actually, the most prominent families of highest status were closest to the church. If you're kind of raggedy, you might be way out, way out far away. Right? You're literally positioned in relation to the church. Status was important. Men are supposed to be responsible for field work. Women were supposed to be responsible for the work of the household. But they also managed the household, which meant if you had cows and milk, they might be the ones bringing that milk to market and actually trading. They might bring the eggs to market. So it is an interesting kind of arrangement. Now, some of these arrangements will be very different from the natives around them. Right? In certain native societies, women did the field work. And some of these folks were like that. They felt like those women were enslaved, where that might give women a certain level of power. We'll talk more about that later on, too. Adultery was a capital crime. You could be executed, right? But some scholars also talk about how within marriage, Puritans might have been a little more freaky than we thought. They celebrated sexuality within marriage. But if you were outside of marriage, it could get you killed. Think about the Scarlet Letter and all that kind of stuff, right? But the ideal of the day was subordination of men to women. Authority was important. But authority was important generally speaking. And this is where we kind of end here, because this is a community of dissent. This is a community of dissent. They're dissenters. They question authority, but they were not very open to others questioning authority. How do we know? Well, we're going to see it, and actually it's going to lead to the development of new towns. It's going to lead to the development of new colonies. For example, these Puritans immigrate seeking religious freedom, but they do not allow others to practice that freedom. For example, Thomas Hooker. Thomas Hooker is a minister, a Puritan minister, a minister in the Congregationalist church, as they would say, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Right? He's a minister, but he disagreed with Puritan leaders over certain things. Thomas Hooker believed that suffrage, I don't know if you know this term, suffrage. You may see the term suffrage or the franchise, the right of the franchise. If you see that in history texts, they're talking about voting rights. So Thomas Hooker believed that suffrage rights or voting rights should not only be limited to male church members. At the time, it was limited to only male church members, and Thomas Hooker thought that was wrong. He's kind of arguing for a broadening of democracy, essentially, right? That more people should have a voice in the society. Well, this made him radical. This makes Thomas Hooker radical for the time. And he's going to be asked to leave. In 1636, he will lead his followers west and found the town of Hartford, now Hartford, Connecticut. Right, so he was in Cambridge. He questions authority. He's got to go. He will found Hartford, Connecticut. Historians have talked about this process as like a beehive. When it gets too big, you got to split off into two, right? This is kind of what's happening in Massachusetts at this time. The town's not big enough for the both of them, right? So somebody's got to go. Thomas Hooker will do this and actually found a new town. And eventually he helps write the orders for the colony of Connecticut. A second major dissenter is a guy named Roger Williams. Roger Williams is a really important figure historically. He is going to be seen as extremely radical. He also is a minister. Roger Williams was a Puritan minister in Salem. But he also comes to question authority. Roger Williams had come to New England in 1631. He served a congregation in Salem, but he believed in three things that suddenly make him problematic. Number one, he believed in religious toleration. He believed that people should be able to worship God in the way that they see fit. This makes him radical. Number two, he believed in a separation of church and state. This makes him radical for the time. Remember, Puritan society is based on a combination of church and state, essentially, as we saw in the episode. Number three, he believed that the colonists had no right to take Native American land. They had to bargain with the Native Americans. They had to pay for it. This makes him extremely radical for the time, right? People are like, what are you talking about? This is crazy talk. He says it's right, right? That's what he saw when he read his Bible. So they had no absolute right to Indian land. They had to bargain for it. So this makes him dangerous. He's seen as extremely dangerous. He will be banished from the colony. So what does he do? He and his followers will leave. They emigrate. Now, partially because he had such good relations and a reputation with the native peoples, he will go to Narragansett country, right, and establish the town of Providence, now Providence, Rhode Island. So Roger Williams, this early dissenter, is a good example of kind of how things are playing out in New England, and also how New England is going to grow. Now you got not one colony, but several, right, because of these disagreements. The next year, Anne Hutchinson arrives in New England in 1634. She leads a religious discussion group, especially among women. Right? And Anne Hutchinson, as a woman questioning authority, is going to be seen as doubly dangerous. Right? Because women questioning male authority and questioning religious authority makes her extremely radical. She argued against too much attention being placed on good works. Right? Anne Hutchinson would be called before the court, and she said that God talked to her directly, and that in the minds of some that was blasphemy. Right? She also questioned male leadership. Right? And she's sort of teaching these classes, especially among pregnant women that are not in church at the time. It kind of makes her suspect. She and her followers will leave after she's banished, after she's excommunicated, and they go join Roger Williams' settlement in 1638. Eventually, Anne Hutchinson would keep moving. She actually went to New York. Unfortunately, she ran into some conflict. She ran into some natives that were not so friendly with the society, and she got killed. But she's seen as a symbol of dissent. A third group of dissenters, Samuel Gorton and his followers, also get banished from the Bay Colony. They will also go to the Narragansett area, and he, Roger Williams, and others will receive a charter creating the colony of Rhode Island in 1644. So Massachusetts grows. It hives off, right? New England is growing. By the 1670s, the Massachusetts population is more than 40,000, but you also have these other kind of growing societies. Most of Massachusetts is concentrated around Boston, but it also extends down the Connecticut River, Valley, New Hampshire, all the way to New Hampshire. Later, Maine is going to break off as a piece of Massachusetts. That's not until it doesn't officially become Maine as a state until 1820, but it's initially was a part of Massachusetts. So, in many ways, I think you have more than enough background now on New England. Perhaps we can relate this back to the witch trials episode here in a second. But first,